child again because the child had not been on treatment for several months. And as I talked about earlier, the minute you take away the drugs, that factory usually starts again, and you start to get viral replication. But in this case, there was no virus. The child tested negative. And the doctor who I spoke to said, at first, I was scared to death because I thought I had made a terrible mistake, that I had taken a child who was negative and put them on treatment. But we went back to all of the laboratory work that was done in the early months of the child's life, all of which was positive. So then I called up the lab, angry, because I thought the lab had made a mistake, that they had sent me a negative sample when in fact we all knew this child was infected. So they redid the work and it came back negative again. And now here we are several months after that, and there's still no sign of virus in the child. The child clearly looks like the child was cured. What cured that child? Why was that child cured? Probably, at least we think, is that after you go through this process and a certain numbers of the virus become latent, they create what's known as a viral reservoir. It is that viral reservoir of latent cells which makes curing people ultimately so difficult, because you take the drugs away and the factory starts again. But if you can treat people soon enough after their infection, you can actually prevent the establishment of viral reservoirs. And that's what we believe happened in this child cured, is that we got to the child soon enough, even after the child had been infected, but sooner than the viral reservoirs had been established. And if you can do that, you can probably cure people of this disease. The last case that's very, very important is what's known as the Visconti Cohort. Do we have any film buffs in the audience? Anybody know who Visconti was? Opera buffs? Oh, you're all too young, aren't you?
Where do you want us to go with the Visconti reference?
Tell me who he was.
Well, Italian film director. I'm trying really hard to remember some names of his stuff. I don't know that I can.
A Death in Venice was probably his most popular film. Yeah, great film, The Death in Venice. Luchino Visconti was an Italian film director. This has nothing to do with that. I just like throwing it out there. Yeah, I like opera, so I love throwing it out there. Visconti is actually an acronym that the French came up with. Don't ask me what it means. I have no idea. But it's a cohort of people in Europe that have been identified and followed for a very, very long time. And these people make up what we describe as the third type of cure, because they're all living with the virus, right? None of them are infectious. They all have very, very low levels of virus, and none of them are on treatment. So the virus is present, but it's not doing anything. We don't fully understand why, but these people, for all intents and purposes, are what we call functionally cured, right? Because all of us, every one of you in this room, I guarantee, are living right now with viruses in your body. We all have certain viruses that are ubiquitous in the human ecology, which we all live with, right? Herpes viruses, CMV, there are all kinds of viruses that we live with in our bodies that for the most part don't do anything. And in the context of this Visconti cohort of patients in Europe, they're living with HIV and it's not doing anything. They are essentially functionally cured. How they got there seems to be a process of having treated them very early. It's also related to that notion of viral reservoirs and driving down the amount of virus in their bodies to very low levels very early on and very quickly. The last case I'm going to talk about is a couple of patients that were reported earlier this year in the New York Times and a bunch of other places you might have heard about. It was at a meeting in Malaysia where they were a couple of patients who were treated with stem cell transplants but did not have donors that had the CCR5 mutation. These were just regular patients with HIV who underwent stem cell transplants because they had a secondary condition like cancer. And their virus levels were driven down so low that none of the molecular biology that we have at our disposal could find virus in these patients. None of them. And yet, the donors who provided the stem cells to these patients did not have the CCR5 mutation because, as I say, that's a very rare thing to find. an HLA match with a CCR5 mutation. And so the doctor who was treating them decided to do the stem cells and try to explore the role that graft versus host disease would play in potentially curing people, right? Graft versus host disease is a condition that occurs when someone undergoes a transplant. It's the notion of the body not recognizing this new transplant as part of the human body. It thinks of it as a disease. So it will often attack. A person who undergoes a kidney transplant, for example, runs a lifelong risk of the body not recognizing that kidney and attacking it as foreign. So people who undergo transplants spend a lifetime on immunosuppressive drugs to try to keep the immune system from recognizing this foreign body and then trying to attack it. Yet that very immune process itself of attacking a foreign body may play a critical role in the cure process. When people undergo stem cell transplants, the notion that the body is going to attack a certain number of cells as foreign may actually help in attacking viruses that are already there inside the cells. We don't know the answer to that, and it's really much too early to know if these patients have in fact been cured. But they have already set a record for the length of time that they have gone without the presence of virus. One of them has gone more than 40 weeks without the virus returning. Will it return? I don't know. I don't think we know the answer to that yet. But I do think we've learned a great deal about the role that graft versus host disease is playing in this process. So all of these cases, all four of these cases, ultimately lead me to believe that a cure is actually much closer than many of us think. Because the reality is we've moved from an era of discovery research. We've moved out of a time of discovery research and into a time like the race to the moon. The race to a cure is now a technological challenge. We now know where the moon is. 20 years ago, we didn't when we started this process, but today we do. It's like Sam Broder was the director of the National Cancer Institute 30 years ago when HIV first emerged. And at that time, cancer had the largest research budget on HIV. We didn't have a big NIAID the way we do today. And Sam said that HIV research was like walking into a dark room with a flashlight, right? Wherever you shine the flashlight, you can see very clearly. The problem is nobody knows how big the dark is. You can't tell how big the room is. You don't know how much darkness there is. All you know is that which is illuminated by your flashlight. Today, someone has walked into that room and switched on the light because we understand what we have to do to cure people. And the Berlin patient has illuminated that for us. It has told us not only that a cure is possible, but actually told us the steps that are critically necessary to achieve it. And the Mississippi Child and the Visconti Cohort are telling us that there's more than one way to skin this cat. When we do have a cure, and the cure that we talk about that has to achieve those three steps, the reality is it's going to be very difficult to do. It's not going to work in everybody. In fact, it's only going to work some of the time. And it's probably going to be incredibly expensive. But the history of medicine is that we take things which work sometimes and are very difficult to do and really expensive, and we make them work better, and we make them cheaper, right? And we make them easier to do. Think about the progress that's been made in cancers or dialysis or any other number of examples that you want. We make it easier, cheaper, and more accessible. And I think HIV will be no different in that regard. I think that it will be complicated. It will only work sometimes, and then it'll work more often. And it'll work for more of the people more of the time until we actually get to a time when it'll work for most people most of the time. And it's for those reasons that I actually believe that a cure for AIDS is possible, and that I think it's possible in our lifetime. And that's where I'll end.
Thanks for an engaging talk on this subject. We have some time for Q&A, and as we do at the Woodrow Wilson School always, we'll invite students to ask the first question. Any students with questions?
You mentioned at the end that it's getting difficult, it's not going to work all of the time, and would be very expensive. So I'm interested in how you envision, just theoretically, if that were to happen, how the United States would respond to the areas of the world where it's the most prevalent, and how would people work with that?
Yeah. The response to the AIDS epidemic today is based in the rest of the world. I don't mean in the US or Western Europe. Let's say the developing world, right, where most of HIV/AIDS exists today. The response of the US government is largely treatment-based. I mean, PEPFAR, which you may have heard of, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, is largely a treatment delivery program. And the benefits of that are wide-ranging, right? Treatment drives down new infections because treatment is prevention. It's good for people. It helps communities, gets people back to work. There's all these benefits of treatment. That is the policy of the United States government, and that will probably continue to be the policy of the United States government for many, many years to come. Long after we've started curing people here in the United States, treatment will probably continue to be the policy in most of the developing world because it is something that we now know can be delivered, even long after I think a cure has been developed, because I don't think a cure is going to be easy to deliver to the developing world, right? I mean, think of it this way, right? Here's a simple little way for you to think about it, right? Sorry. If the cure for AIDS was a clean glass of water, right? If this were the cure for AIDS, there are 1 billion people on the planet to whom we could not deliver it, right? 1 billion people go without a clean glass of water every single day. So think about how complex a cure is going to be and what the likelihood is that we're going to be able to deliver that anytime soon. Probably pretty low. But keep in mind that when I talk about a cure, I choose these words very, very carefully because what I say is I believe a broadly accessible cure is possible. That means the scientific foundation for a cure is possible, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to make it accessible in those parts of the world anytime soon, and maybe not even in our lifetime.
Strains.
Yeah.
So I know that because people have been put on these ARV regimens, but then it's really hard to keep up with them, like taking it at the same time every day is kind of a big burden. How would you incorporate that into like a potential cure? Because if there are like resistant strains emerging, then wouldn't that like pose a really big challenge to coming up with a cure?
It might, but a cure, viral resistance is different than, say, resistance to tuberculosis, right? Because when you're dealing with something like a multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, the very treatments that you're using to try to treat and ultimately cure the disease are affected by viral resistance. But theoretically, the kind of approach that we're talking about here to develop a cure, the notion of basically creating resistance to infection itself through CCR5 doesn't rely on the drugs. It relies on a different approach, right? What was important in the Berlin patient was that he underwent a stem cell transplant that had a CCR5 mutation. There didn't play any role in that process whatsoever. So at least theoretically, mind you, we're way out on a limb here now scientifically, but at least theoretically, curing somebody with resistant virus shouldn't be more difficult than curing somebody whose virus is wild type. It shouldn't be. Doesn't mean it won't be. Because ultimately, when we do find a scientific basis for a cure, it may include treatment. And a very simple way to think about this is, resistance, bad, wild type, good. you don't want to have drug resistance. You don't want to have viral resistance because those viruses not only are more difficult to manage, more difficult to treat, they also probably lead to the complications of AIDS much, much faster. They are more pathogenic resistant viruses than non-resistant viruses. So in relationship to a cure, I'm not sure it will make it more difficult, but it certainly will make treatment a lot more difficult. Yes, sir.
You were talking about how you define a cure, and you said the third part of it is if someone is cured, in your opinion, they shouldn't be able to transmit
Right.
the virus in any capacity.
Right.
So I'm just curious, listening to you talk about the Berlin patient and the Visconti group and the Mississippi child. Has it been proven that all three of those cases could not theoretically transmit the HIV virus in some capacity to another person?
There's really no way to prove it because a study would be unethical, right? I mean, you can't send the Berlin patient out and say, go have as much unsafe sex as you can and see if you infect anybody. There's no scientific study that would prove that would be ethical. The Berlin patient is a gay man who now lives in San Francisco, who lived in San Francisco for a few years. He's probably not infectious because nobody can find the virus in this guy, right? Not in his blood, not in his semen, not in any of his bodily fluids that have been looked at. And this guy's been sliced and diced like a Julian fry maker. I mean, he's had more work done on him than probably any other patient we've ever known. And there's no sign of the virus. But probably what's more interesting about him is not that he can't transmit it, but that he also probably can't be infected. Even if he did go out and have unsafe sex with people who are HIV positive, the likelihood is he would not acquire HIV disease because his cells are largely immune to infection. He'd have to be very unlucky to find someone who had a virus that preferred the other doorway, the CXCR4 doorway. And those viruses are out there, but they're pretty rare. And he'd have to find somebody who had that and have unsafe sex with them before he could likely be infected again. So right now, he's probably the hottest date in San Francisco. Yes, sir.
So you emphasized on the Berlin patient, and I mean the Berlin patient in this case is related to to coreceptors CCR5 and CCR4.
Yeah.
So do you think that the possible discovery of a peptide or a drug that can bind to both coreceptors can be a solution against HIV?
I think theoretically, yes, right? Theoretically, what a dual binding, let's call it a drug for the purposes of our conversation. If you could bind to both of those coreceptors, what you would prevent is ongoing infection. But keep in mind that that would do nothing at all about the viral reservoirs, right? The viral reservoirs where virus is latent, no matter what you do to the coreceptors, you're not going to affect those. And the minute you remove those, right, you take the drug away, the factories will kick in and suddenly you have new infection again. So simply preventing the binding or fusion step, which is what you'd be doing with something that blocked both of those coreceptors, in and of itself would not cure someone of HIV because it wouldn't affect the viral reservoirs in any way. So you could block every step in the viral life cycle, right? But you still wouldn't cure someone who was infected unless you could deal with the viral reservoirs. And the viral reservoirs are what really make this challenge so difficult, because we don't know how to turn over the viral reservoirs yet. That's really what it's all about. It's really about figuring out how to turn over the viral reservoirs. If we could do that, we're probably 99% of the way to a cure. Go ahead.
Sorry for asking, but the viral reservoirs, I don't know if I'm correct, they also contain CCR4 or CCR5. So if somehow can have an agonist, let's say, which can activate these reservoirs, then, I mean, maybe what I'm asking is the solution, can the solution be focused on the coreceptors? Because if the reservoirs have CXR from CCR5, we can also deal with activating this.
Yes, but now you're saying something different, because what you're saying is if we had something that could successfully block both of the coreceptors and we had an antagonist that could activate the reservoirs. If you could do both of those things, right? If you could fully activate the reservoirs with an antagonist, then theoretically, yes, you could you could theoretically get to a cure that way. But there have been a lot of studies, and there are a number of studies going on right now around viral and reservoir antagonists using things like HDAC inhibitors and other things. None of them has successfully shown the ability to turn over viral reservoirs completely. And in fact, there was a study published just a couple months ago in the New England Journal which estimated the size of the viral reservoirs. And basically, this is a guy at Johns Hopkins University, a Dr. Bob Silicano, who showed that it turns out the viral reservoirs are about 60 times bigger than we thought. Even the latest biomolecular technology was unable to successfully estimate the size of the viral reservoir until quite recently. I know this is very sciencey. I'm sorry, I promised it wasn't going to be. But the reality is, I mean, I think you're thinking about this in the right way, but you have to keep in mind both parts of the equation. It's not just the actively replicating virus, which you could prevent with coreceptors, but it's also the viral reservoir. If you can deal with both, then theoretically you can get to a cure. Yes, sir.
You did not talk about vaccine research in AIDS, and you didn't talk about the vaccine research, human clinical studies that did not succeed, the high visibility, highly publicized ones. Is that because you think that it's not possible to have an AIDS vaccine, or is that because you think that the approaches that you indicated will lead to a vaccine that could treat AIDS?
I think vaccine research is a whole different ballgame, right? It's like we got together to talk about soccer and you're asking me a question about basketball. It's that different. It really does have to do with preventing infections. I mean, in the purest sense of the word, a vaccine prevents people from getting infected. A cure is intended for the 35 million people who are already infected. So I'm talking about cure today partly because my organization believes, as you have just suggested, that getting to a cure is far more likely than getting to a vaccine. Now, nobody would have said that 20 years ago. In fact, when Bill Clinton was president, he said, I think it was in 1994, that we would have a vaccine in 3 years. He announced some big initiative. Boy, was that naive. And the reality is, 30 years into this epidemic, I think most, not all, but most people in the scientific community would tell you today that a cure is far more likely in our lifetime than a vaccine is. A vaccine is just a very different kind of challenge and far more complex, I think, than a cure. Others? Yes, ma'am.
If your goal is to cut the number of people living with HIV and AIDS right now in half, maybe that's a little ambitious for like our lifetime or your lifetime. What do you think once you get to the point that you have a cure is the most effective way to do that? Like, is that like you as like a private like organization? Do you think it is like putting it up to the government or going like the nonprofit route and kind of just going after those potential super spreaders, the drug users, the like prostitutes, anything like that? Or
You know, my own opinion on this, it's really just an opinion, is I've been in the AIDS epidemic all of my adult life. It's the only work I've ever done. I've been at amfAR 20 years. And prior to that, I was at NYU and Bellevue Hospital in New York City. So this is the only real work I've ever done. And as I've traveled the world, and I've been on every continent where HIV exists, and looked at programs that have dealt with the epidemic in their country successfully, there is one, I think, generally shared attribute of successful responses to the epidemic in any setting. And when we talk about successful responses, we're talking about places like Brazil and Thailand and other places that have successfully responded. The single most important common shared attribute is political leadership. I don't think you can go into a country and affect the AIDS epidemic successfully unless you have the government as a willing and active partner in that process. I don't think that the private sector or NGOs can do it on their own. Now, that being said, people who are a lot smarter than me know, they look back over the last 30 years about the progress that was made in much of the developing world around reproductive health. And much of that progress is a direct result of the non-government sector, that the nonprofits and NGOs really drove the success in reproductive health in much of the developing world, and not governments. But I don't know that that's necessarily applicable in the context of HIV. I think it's very, very different. Reproductive health is not a disease, right? It's not HIV or polio or malaria or anything else. I think in the context of this public health issue, that without government as an active partner in the process, your effort ultimately is not sustainable and will fail. So to achieve the goals that you're talking about, let's say the goal is cutting in half the number of new infections, right? Instead of 7,000 new infections every day, we were at 3,500 new infections every day. I think the only way you get there is through the active participation of government. And in places where you don't have that and where you have antagonistic governments, I think you begin to see epidemics which are spinning out of control. Did that answer your question?
A bit,
Sort of.
yeah. I don't know, I'm just thinking of, well, I guess there wouldn't be any like incentives for governments to not want to give out a cure, but I guess that comes down to just the first cure you get would be like very, very expensive. And like if the government had access to a cure, like how they would manage that across just different like populations within that country.
We're a long way from that point.
Yeah.
We're so far away from it that it's almost impossible to imagine, right? I mean, I'm an optimist by nature, so I'm hopeful that when that day comes, governments will want to participate. But we're a long way from crossing that bridge. Yes, ma'am.
Well, so money, what about the money? And I'd like to know your level of confidence in that. I'm just looking at the New York Times article today, 12 billion pledged to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and your director of public policy saying,
Chris.
This is Chris
Yeah.
saying, this is disappointing. So at the end of the day, we're very far away from this, and a lot of it is about the global will to finance this. What do you think about that?
None of that $12 billion is directed at research. Not a single dollar of it. And I would argue that it is for that very reason, right? What that article says is $12 billion has been pledged to the Global Fund to fight 3 diseases, AIDS, TB, and malaria. What the Global Fund had hoped for was $15 billion. So they were about $3 billion short of what they had hoped for. And when the Global Fund was created, the goal was to achieve $10 billion a year to the and near that, right? We're not even close. All of that, to me, is an argument for why we should be spending more on cure research, right? 3% of the NIH's AIDS research budget is going to cure research. That's criminal. That's ridiculous. Because, I mean, okay, I'm an optimist, right? I'm a dreamer, but if I had 1 billion of that 12 billion, we'd have a cure for this disease in less than 10 years. Absolutely, promise you. We would have the scientific foundations of a cure in place. But the reality is that the cure research is badly underfunded. And that's where we should be making our investments, right? I mean, I'm all in favor of treatment. I said that earlier. I want to provide the treatment and care that people need. But where we should be ramping up our efforts is in the research that gets us to a cure, because ultimately that 12 billion that just went to the Global Fund is simply not sustainable. It won't be, I promise you. Yes,
I
ma'am.
guess like going off of that, what do you see are like the reasons why more money isn't directed at cure research?
Because I think until only recently, most people haven't understood that it's even possible. I think most, even in the scientific community, I mean, my organization about 5 years ago was the first to use that 4-letter word, cure. And believe me, it felt like we were using a 4-letter word. Because we went out 5 years ago and said, look, you know, what is the point of a research organization like ours existing if we're not prepared to talk about what it is we're trying to do? And what we're trying to do is find a cure for this disease. And people went, oh my God, you can't say that. How dare you say cure? And I got hate mail from people in the activist community. Now, mind you, I was a member of ACT UP. I mean, I'm too old to be an activist today because I can't afford to spend any more nights in jail. But when I was younger and spending nights in jail, you know, I was with the AIDS community for many years as an activist. And those same people wrote to me and said, you can't say this. You're giving people false hope. You know, why would you talk about cure? And my response was very simple. You know, first of all, I don't believe in false hope. I think there's just hope, right? You either have hope or you don't, but there's no such thing as false hope. There's just either the belief that something good could happen or not. And if we were giving people hope, I'm all for hope, right? If I have to choose, I'm going to choose on the side of hope. But I'm also an optimist. I ultimately also believe that you can't get to where you're going unless you know where it is you're going and then say, this is where I'm going. And where we're going is to find a cure. You can come along if you want to. If you don't, that's fine. But I got emails from scientists telling me, what are you talking about? There's no such thing as a cure. How could you tell anybody that you're going to try to find a cure? Really, that's how ridiculous it was. Today, everybody's on board. The whole scientific community believes. I mean, I can't find a person today in the scientific community who doesn't believe that a cure is possible. Now people really, it's not a question of whether it's possible. The Berlin patient is cured. The question is, can we come up with something that's going to work for more of the people more of the time? That's the only real question. And when? How long is it going to take? But the when part of it is a financial question. It's the question of finding the resources.
We have time for one more question.
One more. Anybody? No takers?
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
Why isn't syringe exchange funded in most areas of America?
Why isn't it
Purely
funded?
cost? You said that syringe exchange programs weren't funded in parts of America.
It's not funded because conservatives believe that harm reduction as a principle is not one that should be supported with taxpayer dollars, right? Now, I disagree with that, obviously, right? I believe that, you know, the public health response would be to make syringes available. I believe that the financial argument is overwhelmingly clear. You know, it's cost effective. It would save millions and millions of dollars, not to mention countless lives that could be saved. But here's an equivalent argument, right? Because this is the argument basically that harm reduction makes, is that you're trying to reduce the harm. You accept the fact that a certain number of people are going to participate in an activity that is harmful. And you want to try to reduce that harm by giving them the tools to make it safe. Now, if that's the harm reduction principle, why don't we set up special traffic lanes for drunk drivers? You know how many people are killed by drunk drivers in this country every year? Right? Rather than saying, well, you're just going to go to jail and lose your license if you get drunk and drive, why not set up special traffic lanes to allow drunk drivers to drive in lanes and not be a danger to the rest of the driving community? It's the same principle, right? You guys think I'm nuts. It is nuts. I agree. It's a crazy idea. And it's not one that I'm advocating, but I'm asking you to think about the principle of harm reduction itself, because that's what conservatives think. They think that it's wrong to spend taxpayer dollars to reduce a harmful activity that people in their mind shouldn't be doing anyway.
But it has been proven elsewhere to work, so.
Not elsewhere, it's been proven right here.
Oh, well.
It's been proven right here to work and to be cost effective. But this is no longer a cost effective or an efficacy argument, it's an ideological argument. And once you get into an ideological argument, you cannot win, right? Because there are people who believe fanatically in their ideological position. And what's a fanatic, right? Winston Churchill said a fanatic is somebody who can't change their mind and won't change the subject. And that's what we have. Thank you guys very, very much. Appreciate it.